Hi everyone, my name is Gyda. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Lausanne with 𝐚𝐤𝐫𝐝𝐻𝐁, where I'm studying the links between globalization and insect invasions. We're in a period of massive global change, which includes how we humans are rearranging patterns of biodiversity at the global scale. For example, the background here shows global shipping routes, connecting geographically distant parts of the world and providing opportunities for species to be exchanged between them. Unlike a lot of non-native plants or vertebrates, insects are mostly introduced unintentionally through the movement of various commodities, either as contaminants, where part of their natural habitat is transported, or as hitchhikers attached to various other commodities. While they are tiny and frequently overlooked, insects are crucial for ecosystem functioning and can have some pretty dramatic impacts when they're introduced outside of their native ranges. The invasive ones have widespread and pretty expensive impacts on native biodiversity, agriculture, infrastructure, and human health. It's clear that these non-native insects are here to stay. So how can we manage the ones that are causing problems? Massively using pesticides to control invasive insects is problematic for obvious reasons, but there are more organic alternatives. Classical biological control involves the intentional introduction of a species' natural enemies to control their population in the introduced range. While there have been plenty herbivores introduced to control weeds, we'll focus on insects introduced to control other insects. These biocontrol agents are either predators that attack and feed on the insects in question, or parasitoids whose larvae develop inside their insect hosts and eventually kill them. After some early trial and error, there's been pretty rigorous processes in place since the 1980s to ensure that the species we introduced are actually effective and that they don't themselves go on to have negative impacts. This involves extensive testing for host choices, selecting for specialist species that will target the pest insect and ideally nothing else. At the same time, there's a huge diversity of insects being transported around the world through human trade and travel. These accidental introductions, including predators and parasitoids, have huge potential to cause ecological impacts. Also, these unintentional introductions may be selecting for generalist species that are more likely to enter human-mediated introduction pathways, rather than the specialists we would choose to introduce. Non-native insect introductions go through a series of stages, where initially they're transported outside of their native range. The survivors are introduced to someone new, or either by themselves or potentially with some human assistance if you're a biocontrol agent. If the conditions are right, they go on to establish a population in this new area and potentially also spread further and impact the local ecosystems, either positively or negatively. We generally only observe the later stages of the invasion process for unintentional introductions, so how can we know which insects are arriving? Fortunately, quite a few countries perform inspections of cargo, baggage, and mail arriving at the border as part of national biosecurity measures. We've used border interception records in the United States over the last century to describe the diversity and prevalence of accidental biocontrol introductions. These records provide information on the insect taxa arriving, what commodities they were associated with, when they arrived, and where they've come from. We look for records of largely predatory or parasitoid insect families, as a lot of the interceptions aren't identified at species level, and many of these tiny millimeter-long little parasitoids haven't been described yet. We also have fairly comprehensive lists of which insects have established in the US and whether they're considered invasive there. And the potential impact of these insects is going to depend a lot on their host breadth, so we categorize this based on literature searches. In the end, there were over 35,000 records of predatory and parasitoid insects arriving in the US during the last century. These belong to 93 different families from 11 different orders of insects. The most frequently detected ones are Coleoptera, Hemiptera, and Hymenoptera. If we look at a diversity of different families arriving to the left, we've got predators shown in pink and parasitoids in turquoise. And there's a particularly large diversity of parasitoid Hymenopteran families arriving. The next question is, where are all these insects coming from? Turns out the majority of them arriving in the US came from the Neotropical and Panamanian biogeographic regions, so moving within the Americas. And then there's also a whole lot arriving from the Western Palearctic, or Europe, probably due to our long history of trade and colonization. Biocontrol agents, they're generally introduced from a single population to avoid problems with intraspecific variation in host preferences. But what happens when they're arriving by accident? If we look at the records identified to species level, a quarter of the species were recorded coming from more than one country, and 21% from more than one biogeographic region. This has implications for their genetic diversity and could increase their establishment success and potential for causing ecological impacts. Managing invasions efficiently starts with their introduction pathways. The earlier in the process you intervene, the more efficient it is. So how are our predators and parasitoids being transported? Overall, these accidental biocontrol insects were associated with 14 different broad types of commodities. But similarly, for most other insects, most of the interceptions were with various plant products, shown here in green. However, the main introduction pathways did vary depending on where they were arriving from. For example, to the right here, you've got this chunk of yellow from the Western Palearctic, which is ceramic tiles, which really represent a major source coming from this region. The same goes if we look at different types of plant products. For example, it's mainly fruits from Central America and mostly live plants or cut flowers arriving from Europe that are important targets for management. If we look further at the records identified at species level, there were 184 different species detected belonging to the families we searched for. We can classify the diversity of hosts of prey that they use, ranging from generalists to specialists. And over 80% of these species are polyphagous generalists, where they're attacking almost any insect of a size that they can handle. And just 3 of the species were highly specialized on a single host genus. Risk assessments for non-native insects, they tend to rely on species' previous invasion history. And quite a few of the species we detected have already been able to establish in the US or elsewhere in the world, either intentionally as biocontrol agents, shown here in green, as unintentional introductions, here in blue. And some of these have become invasive, spreading widely and causing negative impacts, shown here in red. If we look at the species that are arriving at the border but haven't been able to establish yet, it's likely that many of them would find suitable hosts on arrival. Of course, there are other factors that are important for establishment success, but the vast majority of predators arriving are generalists, and they can feed on a wide range of different insects, and 3/4 of the parasitoids have at least one known host species present in the US. Whether they then would have significant impact on local ecosystems is a different question, but we do know that several of the species have been used or studied as biocontrol agents around the world, and potentially could also control their host populations in the US. Others are known to be invasive, and there are 3 of these really problematic species that are arriving at a border, but haven't yet had the chance to establish. So we'll have to see how that pans out in the future. To wrap things up, there's a pretty high abundance and diversity of these accidental biocontrol insects that are being transported unintentionally through the commodity trade. Most of these insects arriving in the US have come from within the Americas, along with a sizable number from Europe. This probably reflects trade patterns over the last century. Similar for most other insects, plant products are the main introduction pathway and are therefore key to managing new introductions. However, there is regional variation in which commodities are important, and there's a broad range of commodities we need to consider. Contrary to the species that are being selected as safe and efficient biocontrol agents these days, most of the species arriving are host generalists, and it's likely that there are suitable host species available for many of these insects if they are eventually introduced, improving their chances of establishing successfully. This stands in sharp contrast to the restricted processes for classical biological control, and the ecological impacts of some of these insects, both positive and negative, could be considerable. With that, I'd like to quickly thank my supervisors, 𝐚𝐤𝐫𝐝𝐻𝐁 and Sébastien Ollier, our lovely collaborators, and all of you for listening. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. Bye.